Record.
All right. So, hello everyone. Welcome to my humble abode. I will be your guest tonight, and I will be speaking about Transylvania and Gothic fiction, and Gothic fiction in Transylvania. And if you were enticed here with the promise of vampires, because my quote is from Dracula, um, you've been already locked in this space and in this imaginary geography. And I will emphasize the fact that my presentation deals mostly with Transylvania as an imaginary geography and less so with vampires strictly. And also, it will start debating why this real mapped space becomes entangled with Gothic visions. But to put the quote in context, in case you don't remember it, it was on page 26. It's when Dracula introduces his own preferences for the spaces he inhabits. And he says, and I quote, "I am glad that it is old and big. I myself am of an old family, and to live in a new house would kill me. A house cannot be made habitable in a day, and after all, how few days go to make up a century. I rejoice also that there is a chapel of old times. We Transylvanian nobles love not to think that our bones may be amongst the common dead." And this is something we have to keep in mind as we go on. This idea that a new house, a new form would threaten these old patterns, and how much the Gothic relies on harkening back to a past shrouded in mystery, shrouded in the mist, hidden within the woods. Which is why I chose as the background this image of Bran Castle that a lot of you would associate with Dracula, even though the voivode himself, Vlad the Impaler, who is supposed to have inspired this vision, doesn't really have any actual ties to the Bran Castle, since he was actually born in Sikishara, and he actually ruled Wallachia to the south, which is mostly a world of plains and of this summer sun that never seems to set. So completely opposite. So how did we get here? Well, again, let's try to keep in mind this idea of old forms threatening to burst open if you try to pour in new content. Transylvania itself as a word is very peculiar because it doesn't really say what it is. It's a negative definition. It just tells you what it is not. So Transylvania from Latin actually just means beyond the forest. But even if you look at the other words we know Transylvania by, like Erdely, which inspired the Romanian word Ardeal, also just means beyond the woods. Überwald in German, again, just beyond the woods. All three just suggest this image of Transylvania as a terra incognita, something that frustrates the imperialist civilizing project, something that cannot really be known. And even if you look at the maps themselves, this is a map from the 15th century, this is a map from the 16th century, there's an emphasis more on these woods here and on the very presence of the Carpathian mountain range. So there's always less of a focus on the actual human settlements here and the artifacts that document their presence, and more the idea that a human element, once threatened, it can always retreat into the mountains. And the human element here is almost always seen as barely human, almost feral. And we'll get into that a bit later. But for those of you who aren't Romanian and aren't really sure where to place Transylvania on the map, I'll just try to get you up to speed real quick and also to explain why it is such a hotly contested place. So as you can see here, the word Dacia, this was the pre-Roman name for the area, where the Dacians, who were part of the Thracian family, which were a Celtic people, who used to live. And we know precious little about them because they didn't really leave any written records behind. A lot of them would have been bilingual because they were trading with the Greeks. So we would get information about them from the Greeks, a lot of it very satirical about their self-importance while the Romans would be even less favorable to the Dacians because they would be warring on and off again. And in 2nd century, Dacia would also be conquered by the Romans, who would establish administrative centers here. And unlike other Roman provinces, the people very readily assimilated into the Roman Empire, very readily took up the language. And once we have the Slavic migrations here, and even the Asiatic and Germanic migrations, we notice that even Byzantine sources speak of these people here again with a negative definition, not who they are, but who they are not. They are not Slavic in a sea of Slavic people. They are the only Romance culture there, and they would be called Vlachs or Olach. But a lot of them would be mostly documented again by their artifacts and less by what they write. And you see that especially if you check toponyms. So, for example, you would have the very same river have a Slavic name in the plains, the Bistrica, which would mean well, the quick river, and up the mountain where the Vlachs would have retreated, it would be called Repedia, the very same river. And this pattern happens again and again. But why did I give the name for Transylvania in 3 different languages? Well, it's because Transylvania doesn't really have a streamlined Enlightenment era story, an origin story where you can just simply say, well, these are the people who lived there, this is their language. It was always multicultural. So it was always resisting this very neat narrative. And yes, you had the Vlachs, like I just mentioned, but you also had Hungarians who settled here in the second half of the 10th century. And at first, they were not Christian, but they did convert to Christianity in 1000, in the year 1000 with Stephen the First. And later on, they would also, after the Great Schism, they would side with the Catholic Church rather than the Christian Orthodox Church. The Vlachs would be Christian Orthodox, so that would immerse them even more into this Slavic culture. And indeed, they would be using the Cyrillic alphabet well into the 18th century. And why did I add the German name for it? Well, because besides the Hungarians here, there will also be German colonizers, Saxon colonizers, up to this edge of the Carpathian Arc. And this is why this map doesn't just include the word Transylvania, it also says Siebenbürgen. Siebenbürgen meaning 7 fortresses, 7 Saxon fortresses. So when we speak about the Gothic, we have to bear in mind the fact that it is a Germanic mode. It also enters Transylvania as a foreign element. So most of the Gothic architecture would have come through Germanic orders, the Teutonic order, the Cistercian order. Even if we look at the very first instances of the Gothic in Romania, for example, the Church of Cisnedia, it would all have been Germanic. And we have to keep this in mind because this imperialist lens is very fruitful when we discuss how Transylvania is represented. And also when it comes to the issue of self-representation, of self-determination. This is, well, the unified heraldry of Transylvania. Of course, there are previous versions you can find. Yellow and red come up again and again, but sometimes this blue is replaced by green. However, in the 18th century, the Empress Maria Theresa settles for this version, which harks back on the heraldry that was suggested in the 16th century. Once the 3 main ethnicities that had political rights chose to basically band together to crush the peasant rebels that kept bursting up again and again. Most of these peasants would have been illiterate Vlachs. And if you look even at the stem itself, you have the black eagle or the black raven, which would have stood for the Hungarian nobility. Even if you think of the few Romanians that assimilated into Hungarian nobility, they would have done it also by converting to Catholicism. So if you think, for example, of Ion de Hunedoara, if you think of the Corvin family, again, Corvin, Raven, you get the feel. And also you get the idea that this is a militant bird because of its position. It's right by this red band, and this red band stands for the fortress wall. So it's a raven that overlooks the fortress and has to protect it. Who is it protecting it against? Well, obviously all the Asiatic tribes, the Mongols especially, who would be burning everything to the ground, but also against the peasants, because like I was saying, they kept rebelling on and off. In the background, you would have usually the sun and the moon, and you can see it here as well, the sun and the moon here, and the sun and the moon here. That would stand for the sekeli or sekui. These were, and the very word itself just means the frontier guards. So this would have been the even more militarized faction that some people speculated it would have been Magyarized Turks. They themselves claim their legacy back from Attila the Hun. So if this is for the nobility that is defending the law, the Sekeli are defending by sword. And another interesting thing, if you compare to the actual representation of the Sekeli on the Hungarian stem compared to the Romanian stem, they keep the crescent moon, and here you have a waxing moon. So already a question of whether they're gaining power or not. And here are the 7 fortresses that would have stood for the first most important Saxon fortresses. And a lot of people would have latched onto this blue background as a silent acknowledgement of the Vlach majority, because to the south, Wallachia, which was also inhabited by mostly by Vlachs, would have used azure flags a lot in battle. And when I speak about Transylvania, we have to bear in mind the fact that it's not a self-contained space. Yes, you do have the Carpathian range mostly keeping it together, but you have to understand that with the forest and everything, there's a history of moving in between provinces, in between Transylvania and Moldavia to the east, or Transylvania and Wallachia to the south. And indeed, the history of Romania is repeatedly described in the terms of dismountings, descolecări, which just means a voivod escaping a political rival by moving into another predominantly Vlach inhabited province. So this history isn't really that streamlined. You don't really have any a modern narrative until significantly later on. So one of the reasons why the Gothic is seen as such an alien feature is because they can't really look back on any beloved ruins. Those ruins would have belonged to the German colonizers. And even as we acknowledge this, we have to point out that the Middle Ages were significantly longer in Transylvania. So the Middle Ages would have actually started around the 12th century, so a century before Italy was kind of gearing up towards Renaissance. But around the 12th century, when most of the Asiatic migrations would have settled down a bit, and then only properly ends at the end of the 16th century. That's a very long medieval age with very, very few documents left, a lot of them contested, a lot of them anonymous. Why the end of the 16th century? Because that's the first time the 3 provinces are unified by Michael the Brave, but that only lasts for about a year, and then he dies. And these 3 colors are taken up by Transylvanians arguing for their political rights. And in solidarity, the rest of the Vlachs in the other 2 provinces that will become the Old Kingdom under a German king again, will adopt these 3 colors. However, they will no longer have them set up horizontally, they will set them up vertically, imitating the French. Because by leaving behind the Germanic model, they are trying to claim almost sisterhood with the French, and they are trying to latch on to that Roman link as a claim to actually being civilized subjects who deserve rights. Now that I've clarified that, this is a painting representing the May 1848 gathering at Blage. You can see these flags, and you can understand why this multicultural space was very difficult to understand, even by Central Europeans, and why for so long it simply became the other of the West. And even as we already have these main four ethnicities, of course, there's more variety here. It is far more, it is further north, but it's still very Balkan in feeling. So you have a significant Jewish population, you also have a significant Roma population, and this complicates issues. But at the same time, it is a deeply superstitious place. So in the 18th century, you don't just have a lot of political unrest, you also have a vampire craze sweeping Eastern Europe. So much so that in 1766, the Hungarian Empress Maria Theresa that I mentioned before had to formally forbid both witch hunts and vampire hunts. And she had to double down again 2 years later, forbidding the persecution of magical activity. Well, this doesn't mean that magic was effectively legal in Transylvania, not at all. It just means that people were no longer allowed to scapegoat their political or social enemies by accusing them of witchcraft, or by accusing them of vampirizing others, of threatening their prosperity using dark magic. And then it's not so much of a surprise that in 1816 we have Lord Byron, John Polidori, who will write The Vampire, Percival Bysshe Shelley, Mary Goodwin Shelley, and Claire Clairmont actually read some of these Germanic accounts of vampirism. But again, as I was saying, all of this is seen through the eyes of an empire. All of this is always cast as the periphery. All of this is always cast as that which resists a clean-cut narrative. You have here the names of the 7 fortresses, and as you noticed, half of them don't truly sound the same in Romanian. Yes, Bistrița sounds like Bistrița, and Mediaș sounds like Mediaș. Personally, I'm from Cluj. Klausenburg doesn't really sound anything like that. And Vlad Impaler was from Salzburg, Sighișoara. And on to this. When do we first get representations of Transylvania outside of actual historic records? Well, one of the earliest Western sources would be Shakespeare, but just in passing in Pericles. He just mentions a random Transylvanian getting killed in the market. That's it, just as a victim, nothing else about him. Otherwise, the Germans would have dramatized the Aussiedlung of the 12th century, the move eastwards, in the Song of the Pied Piper. So there's always this idea that you can expand towards east, but the east will always resist you a bit. And it will resist you a bit also because of its proximity to the Ottoman Empire. And a lot of Transylvanian history is defined by how they resist this expansion of the Ottoman Empire that also threatened the limits of Vienna. So Transylvania isn't just the margin, isn't just a whirlpool of centrifugal forces where you can't really accumulate anything because everything is always threatened by a peasant revolt, and then they just retreat into the woods. It's even more so than that. It's a portal. It's a portal between the West and the East. And Vlad Impaler himself, who ruled in mid 15th century, even though he ruled Wallachia, he had quite a vendetta against the German merchants in Transylvania. So there would have been repeated raids, and that would have, of course, attracted their wrath. And how did they respond? Well, so it was soft power. So you see here a contemporary engraving where you have Vlad the Impaler casually admiring his victims suffering for days on end. Impaling took ages, and it also took a lot of skill. The point was not to kill them immediately. You may think of fangs piercing their bodies when you see this image, but you have to understand that the edge of that pillar would have actually been basically lubed with pig fat in a lot of cases, and the executioner would have had to have quite the significant knowledge of human anatomy to avoid any major organ and any major damage as that pillar pierces their body. So in this image, you see it coming through their stomachs. That's not quite accurate. It would usually enter their body through their rear, and it would exit through their mouth, so that they would be offered to the ravens as live bait. And as you see him eating and just not even averting his gaze, it's just the immediate jump into saying that he was effectively drinking their blood, just as Erzsébet Báthory, the bloody countess, Hungarian bloody countess, who was supposed to have had 600 maidens killed so that she could use their blood to keep herself young forever. But this isn't just, Saxon propaganda. Even other sources suggest that if he saw any of his noblemen avert their gaze from this cruel spectacle, he would have them join them. So he did not like anyone hesitating. He was a very vengeful voivod, and he was also a member of the Order of the Dragon, which his own father had joined. The Order of the Dragon was founded by the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund of Luxembourg, again, to contain the Ottoman expansion threat. And the Order of the Dragon would also have them wear a cape. That was a black cape lined with red. And if you think that sounds a lot like Dracula, that is one of the few things that makes them be connected. But if we look here at a later representation, about a century later, also a German source, we see him take the role not of a disciple of Christ containing the Muslim threat to European civilization. Instead, we see him as an agent of Satan, an agent that takes the place of Pontius Pilate, and instead he victimizes Christ, and he smirks while he does that. So there is this movement between being seen as Vlad Dracula, or the son of the dragon, to being seen as Vlad Dracul, Vlad the devil. It's a nice linguistic coincidence, but one that will be exploited by those who resented him. And this will taint the image the Germans have of Transylvania. And even the very feeble connections some people have claimed between Vlad the Impaler and the Bran Castle, claiming that he was imprisoned there by Hungarians, it's more likely that he was actually imprisoned around Budapest. And again, the Budapest is mostly, Hungary is mostly plains, so that doesn't really mesh with Gothic visions. But the German Schadder novel retains this idea of Transylvania as a place where you go to die, and you go to die a violent death. And as we keep this in mind, we also have to not forget that he threatened the fortunes of others, which he needed for his military exploits. It wasn't just senseless violence. However, as Gothic fiction bubbles up in short bursts whenever someone's finances are threatened, whenever conventional morality is threatened, we have to understand Gothic visions of Transylvania, especially as something that frustrates the Protestant work ethic. So, as I was saying earlier, Hungarians would have mostly been Catholic, but after after the Reform, some of them would have become Calvinist, some of them would have become Unitarian. But the Vlachs would have stayed mostly Orthodox, which is something they would have had more in common with the Slavic population in the Balkans. So they're already heretical, they're already cruel, they're already smirking their way through a decadent lifestyle, according to the empire. And according to later travel writers, for example, the Scottish writer Emily Gerard, who was married to an Austro-Hungarian officer, so again, this is through the eyes of the empire, she discussed in an article Transylvania being the land of superstition, for nowhere else does this curious crooked plant of delusion flourish as persistently and in such bewildering variety. It would almost seem as though the whole species of demons, pixies, witches, and hobgoblins, driven from the rest of Europe by the want of science, had taken refuge within this mountain rampart, well aware that here they would find secure lurking places, whence they might defy their persecutors yet a while. Again, the idea that if you go to Transylvania, you go there to retreat into the woods, you go there to retreat beyond the forest and to escape justice, because there's little justice here. So there's definitely here what Max Lacan would later term geography of fear, but this influences a general view of Transylvania as a superstitious place where the Enlightenment didn't really take root. So even as we look then at self-representation, none of this rings true anymore, because there is this Orientalist lens where Transylvanians see themselves as the last bastion of Western culture against, again, Ottoman expansion. So instead of seeing themselves as centrifugal, or how Jules Verne describes the place as a whirlpool with where all the darkness pulls in and there's barely any air and light coming from civilization, they see themselves as centripetal. So they see themselves as crystallizing together the best ideas from German culture, the best ideas that they can gain from French culture because they're closer to it, and a lot of important Transylvanian public figures would have completed their education in France and then come back. But they also don't see themselves as a relic of the past. So if in a lot of Gothic fiction, we see Transylvania more or less frozen in time in the 19th century, it doesn't really go past that. Transylvanians see themselves more as open towards the future, or more as diurnal. So this would be the kind of images you would find if you looked up not Transylvania, but Ardeal, the Romanian word for it. So this is part of the draw. The way they even market themselves, even in politics, is that they're more Western than their counterparts in Moldavia and Wallachia. Never mind that these three provinces will always cooperate. And more so than that, it isn't just that Transylvania refuses to term itself tumultuous, violent, passionate, vengeful, and all of that kind of Gothic affect. Instead, the word that is most closely associated with Ardeal is actually tihnit. Tihnit is a Transylvanian term that means at once quiet, slow-paced, self-sufficient. So there is this very pastoral vision that is being conjured, this very bucolic vision that here the peasantry is just living its slow life, its good life, and history is happening elsewhere. So even if you look at literature that came about the same time as Gothic vampires were tormenting the West, um, the images are very, very different. So, for example, in Warakunorok, the watermill of good fortune, what we see is a family that has a very tihnit lifestyle, and the protagonist, the husband, risks it all just for class mobility. And the way he achieves it is through dishonest means, by falling to the lure of an almost Byronic anti-hero, Lika Samadaul, who is almost a bit of a cowboy figure in these mountains. And this will come up again when I discuss cinematic representations. This idea of Transylvania as a no man's land that's not so different from the frontier in the United States. And all these diurnal images of the happy family with the young children who settle in the middle of nowhere trying to make a life for themselves, it quickly goes wrong once the protagonist, Gita, is lured and corrupted by money. And then we have significant scenes taking place during a stormy night. Then we have the wife gets seduced by Lika Sabadol. Then we have the police officers trying to follow him into the mountains. We have murder, we have suicide. We are fully in the Gothic now. And the only ones who make it out alive are the only ones left uncorrupted, the children and the grandmother who had warned against being corrupted by money. And poetry at the time would have also insisted on this pastoral mode because the draw is no longer the dramatic model. The draw now is towards reclaiming the Latin aspect, looking back again onto the bucolic, again to claim that they are civilized subjects who are deserving of political rights. But if we look actually at the history of this literature, it's again a fragment in and of itself. When I say a tale in imitation of the German, I'm alluding, of course, to Edgar Allan Poe's short story that is set in Transylvania, even though he's more concerned there with Hungarian families. But if we look at literature in Romanian, we won't really find much. Like I said, they would have used Slavic in their religious rites, and they would have used Cyrillic alphabet for a long, long time. And actually, the very first documentary source we have of Romanian language in and of itself is from the early 16th century, and it's a letter, and all it does is warn against Ottoman military expansion in the south. Again, being caught between multiple empires means that there's very little self-definition and more of this defensive stance. But why do I have this other year in the brackets? That's because even though this is an extremely old letter, it was rediscovered at the end of the 19th century when Romanians were staking the claim that actually we want all three provinces to be together again. It was an Austrian philologist who discovered it and said, oh yes, Romanian actually is a language. These people didn't just come up out of the caves into modernity. They have been here a long time. They just haven't really been noticed by history. And even if we look at self-representations, a lot of them would have taken very, very seriously and to heart this representation of Vlachs as being almost subhuman. So, for example, Dimitrie Cantemir, even though he's Moldavian, he would have interacted a lot with Transylvanian nobles, a lot with Valachian novels, and he wrote Historia Hieroglyphica, which even by the cover you can tell it's much more Baroque. It really looks like the Gothic never happened here. It's much more Oriental. It means the history in hieroglyphs. And why is it called that? Because none of the characters are human. All of the characters are animals, but this is not a fable. All the animals are taken from Heraldry. So it's a novel with a key, Roman Naklev, and it's very Game of Thronesy in its vibe, in its plot. You have all these warring factions that are squabbling amongst themselves while the greater threat in the south is growing. And Ion Budai de Leanu, who was in the 18th century part of the so-called Școala Ardeleană, the Transylvanian school that was arguing towards the emperor that Vlachs would also be deserving of representation. And indeed, there are several memorandums of this kind. They're usually always tried for treason and sent to prison for doing so. He wrote Țiganiada, and Țiganiada was meant to be the third epic after the Iliad and the Aeneid. Again, this attachment to Roman and Greek models, this claim towards civilization, except it's also very humorous, just like history in hieroglyphs. It has a very serious subject, but it's always infused with Balkan humor. And the title itself, the only way to translate it is honestly the Gypsyad. And what it does is it has this setting where at the time of Vlad the Impaler, here he comes up again, he wants to contain the Ottoman threat, of course. So he commissions Roma people to fight for him. And the interesting thing is that Roma people, unfortunately, were chattel slaves for a very long time, and many poets would have actually raised this topic and argue for their personhood as well. I'm thinking of Vasile Alexandri, for example. There is the idea that they are the same level as Vlachs. Vlachs wouldn't have been slaves; they would have been feudal serfs. But neither are recognized as fully human, neither are recognized as European subjects. So in both cases, there is a sort of gallows humor that takes up the accusations that would come from the executor, that you're not quite fully human. And they're both tales of failure. Both epics fail in actually achieving their purported goal, but it's always treated with humor. It's always accepted that yes, failure and the circular history is just it's just the thing here. You don't really have linear history. Um, there is a draw towards it in the 19th century, though, especially because of Edgar Allan Poe. So Livia Quattro, for example, in The Site of Time, discusses how Poe was the one who introduced the Gothic mode to Transylvanians and to Romanians. How? Through Charles Baudelaire. Like I said, they wouldn't Transylvanians wouldn't have really cared much for English language sources, but they would have loved French language sources. And Poe was immediately translated. The very first translation would have been The Pit and the Pendulum in 1861, so pretty fast, and it immediately gathered 6 other versions. And this would have played a lot in how they define the Gothic. The Gothic would no longer be so much so tied to folklore and would achieve these connotations of the great old family and the great old house that is now a ruin. That wouldn't have it wouldn't ring true for their own experience, but it would ring true to the Poe model, which was a tale in an imitation of the German. And I don't want to ignore the fact that yes, there are a great many superstitions in Transylvania. There is some truth to some travelers pointing this out, but a lot of them would be misrepresented, to be honest. So it's less so the dead interfering with the living, strictly so, and it's more the living interceding on behalf of the dead, especially if they failed to help the dead transition into the afterlife seamlessly. So you wouldn't necessarily have actual vampires as we think of them now. Well, every single culture has their own version of a vampire, from Latin America to China. But what we think of as Dracula would be closer to the Assyrian prehistoric model that may have arrived in the Balkans through Turkey. So again, they always blame the Ottomans. And what they find here is actually 3 different entities with 3 different backstories. You would find Moroi, Strigoi, and Prikolic. Moroi would mostly be unbaptized infants who are torturing their careless parents, especially sucking the lifeblood of the mother that failed them. You would have Strigoi, who are threatening the good fortune of their neighbors. They're either making the cow's milk run dry, crops fail, or they're the only ones in the village who are blessed with good fortune, the only ones who manage to multiply their fortunes. And when they die, they keep on feeding off the living. And unlike the Moroi, Strigoi sometimes would be seen as predestined to become so. So it's not just that whether you have a violent death, especially by your own hand, or if you die from a witch's curse, you can become a Strigoi if you are simply the 7th child of the same gender in a family, or if you lead a life of sin, or if you die without being married. So, Prikolic, however, would be almost shapeshifters. They would be able to turn into cats. No, they would not be werewolves. Those would be Vrkolac. But Prikolic would be these very hyperactive children, to the point that the people would be very suspicious of them. How do they have this much energy? They must be vampirizing someone. And often enough, you would be able to tell if someone was indeed a Strigoi, for example, if you were to unearth them. And you have instances of whole villages just picking up everything and moving across the hills to escape the Moroi, the Strigoi, or the Prikolic. For example, there's a case of Saliște, which was completely abandoned in the 18th century, and all the villagers established a new human settlement called Gura Racului in Dolj. It's not Transylvania, but again, these things permeate beyond hard limits. And the elders would still insist that they had to escape the Moroi and the Strigoi, but historic records showed that at the time that they moved, it was because of a plague. It was Ciumalit Karaja. So the graveyards would have been full to the brim, and they would have threatened the actual health of the people there. So there's this idea of trying to offer a supernatural explanation for something that is perfectly natural but they did not know at the time. You see here this garland of garlic at the window. It's not just for vampires, but also against werewolves. And I'm already issuing a warning for you for next Sunday. The next Sunday is the 29th of November, which is St. Andrew's Day. Well, St. Andrew's Night, more precisely, the patron saint of Romania, that is supposed to have Christianized Greeks, and then, of course, the Greek influence here. But he's also the patron saint of wolves. And he's also protecting against the undead that come when the veil is thin. So this would be the Romanian version of Halloween. And there's always something half seductive about these undead. For example, even though most of the Gothic fiction that circulates in Transylvania would be between the end of the 19th century, think Supo, and mid 20th century, because once become a socialist republic, the Gothic was seen alongside fantasy as an immature genre. You still have certain bursts of it. For example, Marin Sorescu wrote La Lilieci, a volume of poetry inspired by these by this kind of very grim folklore in the village where he grew up. And La Lilieci can be translated in two ways. It can be translated as where the lilac bushes are, or where the bats are. And if you thought it's where the bats are, you would actually be wrong, because he's describing the graveyard in his home village that would have these very fragrant, intoxicating, and alluring lilac bushes that will call you out to visit them at night. And when you go out at night, sometimes you actually meet a strigoi, as he does in the poem Dumneata, which is just a polite form of you. And there's always this kind of ecology that has to be kept. You have to stay away from the undead because it can contaminate you. In Dumneata, the dead is instigating you. The strigoi is telling you, grab me by the collar and see if it's me. But if you grab him by the collar, your hand can fall off. So let the dead bury the dead, and as Joyce said, let the dead marry the dead. Some people would point towards happier versions of the afterlife, especially in Transylvania, for example, the Mary Cemetery of Saplința. And you can see here these naive paintings of the dead. You can see the very bright colors. You can see that they have poems about their lives. A lot of them would be very humorous. They would say, oh, Vasile, you were such a drunk. Finally, you're off the drink that you're dead. But this is actually a retconning the Transylvanian vision of the afterlife, I'm sorry to say. So even though there are 800 of such crosses, they would have, the first one would have been painted in 1933 because an artist was influenced by a Romanian historian who was saying, let's stop claiming the Roman model of civilization. Let's stop looking at France. Let's start looking inward. Let's start looking at the pre-Roman civilization that we had here, the Dacians, who were supposed to be happy about dying and joining the Maltese. So this doesn't ring true. What rings true actually is Koliva, and this is the Greek spelling because it was, again, pre-Roman as well. And this is made by boiling arpacaș, which is just the byproduct, leftover husks of any grains when you make flour. So it's very cheap, it's very accessible, and it's very sweet. And the point of it is to be the personal equivalent to the Eucharist. So instead of eating of Christ and drinking his blood, again, cannibalism, again, a vampiric ritual that doesn't really make that much sense to the Germans. Koliva would give you the taste of the sweetness of the afterlife, but it also would give you a taste of the sweetness of the life of the deceased. So it's almost like you're eating the dead, and you're also almost like you're getting a taste of yourself when you will be dead, because these husks of arpacaș are supposed to all, because there are thousands of them in one slice, they're supposed to make you think of you being a part of the greater community. So this is the opposite of what Dracula was saying in Bram Stoker about not wanting to be alongside the commoners. The commoners would want to be together in this very cannibal vision. So this is a place of superstition, and these instances start getting crowded closer and closer together. Of Transylvania as this place with dramatic valleys, with foggy woods with castles, no sighting of the villages. Or is that so? Well, Nosferatu himself, again, this is a German movie which had a limited reception because of Bram Stoker's Widow. He doesn't look seductive. He's not a Byronic hero. He looks almost animal-like. Uh, Unfortunately, there's also a bit of anti-Semitism that could have tainted this vision. The image of Jews as vampires. Uh, and also he's inhabiting, his Transylvania is very barren. He is bleeding dry the area. Bela Lugosi's Transylvania is more Hungarian instead. Even the peasants that we see, they speak Hungarian. We have signs in Hungarian. So it's the same place, but it's already a little more lively. At the end of the day, though, they're still imaginary geographies. We don't really see the blocks. If we want to see the blocks, there's the 2005 volume by Valentina Glajar and Dominika Radulescu, Vampirettes, Wretches, and Amazons, Western Representations of East European Women. But most of the time, Transylvanians are seen as aliens, like in Rocky Horror Picture Show, where Transylvania is actually a galaxy. And these people are very weird, they're very decadent, and they almost have a hive mind of their own, which makes them even more dangerous. But there's always a question, not of whether they're dead or alive, or whatever binaries they may be unsettling. It's always the question of whether they're persons or not. This is an image from Terry Pratchett's Discworld. So again, Uberwald. Are these people, are these creatures existing in a liminal space even people? Are they even comprehensible? Well, in Romanian literature, a lot of it would have come through the folklore tradition, the Gothic seen through the eyes of superstition, having rituals against them mandated by the church. Some of them, though, are pagan. For example, Koliva, to be effective, you have to wash the Arpakash in 9 different waters, just as to clean your house, preparing for the night St. Andrews, you have to clean your windows 9 different times with 9 different waters. But you see these stars here, these are authors who would have translated Poe and then would have taken him as an example. And one way to avoid the lure of this almost satanic vampiric vision is actually by siding with the commoners. So even the Evening Star by Mihai Ionescu, you have the Evening Star that tries to seduce the emperor's daughter. And the way she resists him and refuses to join him in the galaxy and to let him vampirize her is by choosing a servant at her court whose name is just the masculine form of her own name. So there's this sameness, this sense of community that is the way to undo this threat. Mircea Eliade's Domnișoara Cristina, and you can tell by the way her name is spelled, it's different than mine, that there is something alien about her. You don't really spell Cristina in Romanian with an H, because nobility is seen as foreign. So the novella uses as a departing point the 1907 peasant revolt, where the peasants draw blood from the nobles that would have been exploiting them. And this young noblewoman, dead before her time, stalks the property, and she wants to vampirize her own family. And there's something very statuesque about this. So if the folkloric versions of the vampire would have been a peasant coming upon their own family, the Poe version of the vampire would elevate it to this aristocratic mode. Even if you look at the film poster itself, there's something statuesque about her. She's almost a ruin. She's not just a corpse oozing these bodily fluids and disgusting you. No, instead, she's almost becoming inanimate. She's almost becoming an object, but a sex object. There is still a certain Gothic effect, even if we look at Transylvania seen outside of vampire narratives. So, for example, the only author born and raised in Romania who's ever won the Nobel Prize for Literature, Herta Müller, and you can tell by her name that she's German, she has a very dark vision of Transylvania. And that is also because of her own family's experience. So her grandfather would have been a large landowner, and a lot of his property would have been seized. Her father was an SS soldier. So as you can imagine, there was this question of vengeance. And there's this, her image of Transylvania is a carceral image. Again, that geography of fear I was alluding to. This idea that Transylvania is littered with gulags, and there are vengeful people who attack the Germans. So, for example, even in The King Bows Down and Kills, it's not an actual king. It's about the whole secret police apparatus in the Republic, but it's cast as if being royalty that demands blood. This wouldn't be the main, necessarily the main vision in the Romanian new wave of cinema. It would be more an enclosed vision where everything is a hospital, where everybody has a certain sickness, nobody can really ever heal from it. It's very Kafkaesque in a sense as well. If you've watched, for example, The Death of Mr. Lazarescu, there's always a bit of humor, but it's always gallows humor. You always know that it's not going to end well. This still is taken from Scarred Hearts, which adapted Max Blecher's story. So again, the Jewish vision of Transylvania would have been very different from the German vision of Transylvania, especially since, unfortunately, 130,000 Jewish and Roma people would have been deported when Transylvania, well, actually Romania at large, was collaborating with the Nazi regime. And even if you look at another marginal perspective on Transylvania, you have Roma people. For example, Aglaia Veterani, who was raised in a circus family, and they escape Romania and they start touring Germany. Her vision in why the child is cooking into the polenta, again, a vision not unlike that of eating coliva, is that of a world of dark fairy tales, and of threats you can't really understand, and of families with very unhealthy desires and relationships. Again, very Gothic, but not, you don't really see a vampire because the vampire isn't needed to make Transylvania Gothic. But can you ever go beyond the vampire? You can, but you can't really. Even if you look at My Fair Lady, you have the Queen of Transylvania. Transylvania never really had a queen. The very first queen of Romania, though, in the 1880s, would have been German, married to a German king as well, and her literary pseudonym was Carmen Silva. Again, that means the song of the forest. Always this connection between Transylvania and Romania at large with the Carpathians. But having an aristocrat, a queen of Transylvania, there's again something very Poe-esque about it. And when I mentioned before the watermill of good fortune and the cowboy imagery in Transylvania, well, in the 60s and 70s, you would have had the red westerns. So you would have had a series straight up called Transylvanians. And if you look at other Western images of Transylvania that would, well, shock most people, in the late 90s and until the mid 2000s, American evangelist Christians had the series Left Behind, where the Antichrist is called the Nicolae Carpathian. So that's not subtle at all. Here we have instead basically a socialist leader cast as the Antichrist who is bleeding the West dry. So you can take the distance in Beyond the Forest as a trope and play it straight. You can have all of these characters that have loose ties with Transylvania just because they're vampires. Everything is translated immediately. I've actually added here the titles in Romanian just so that you can see there is an appetite in Transylvania for writings about Transylvania and about vampires in general. It doesn't really matter the quality of that particular young adult fiction novel. It's going to get translated maybe even the very same year. But local efforts to write in that mode have failed. For example, Beyond the Night, 12 Faces of the Gothic, again, beyond the impossibility of defining the place, came on the heels of a steampunk Romanian anthology that did much better. And as you can tell by the cover, it played the tropes straight, which is why, by not having a local flavor, it just was too derivative to have anything to draw people in. However, if you look at Beyond the Hills, this is much darker. This was inspired by a real incident that actually happened in Moldavia. But it's a story of two childhood friends. The two of them meet in an orphanage. They develop a very close-knit relationship. They're not really aware of how much they love each other and what kind of love they share until one of them goes to a monastery, and she is subjected to an exorcism, and the other one tries to help her escape the monks. Um, but it but there is this disease narrative of lesbian love as a disease, the question of whether exorcism itself ignores mental illness. Again, the carceral hospital-like space of the monastery, it's much more Gothic than this, and it also did better. But if you can't beat them, sometimes you just have to join them. Sometimes if you can't argue against these visions of Transylvania, what you do is you exploit the simulacrum. So you can even find Hotel Dracula if you ever go to the Tihuta mountain pass. It's not built on an older Saxon fortress. It was actually just built in 1981 with the express goal of drawing in tourists. That's it. And you also have young adult fiction writers in Romania, like Cristina Diamant, who is known as always exploiting the Gothic mode with mixed results, who wrote the trilogy The Last Witch of Transylvania. And you can tell by the cover that's a very Germanic model. And even if you look at all the other instances of Transylvania in movies and video games and whatnot, it's always the idea that this is a liminal space. Hotel Transylvania, it's not a village, it's not a place you can live, it's a hotel. And a hotel is a non-place, just as prisons, just as hospitals, just as all of these beyond places. And at the end of the day, it is an imaginary space more so than a real one, which is why it's so difficult to find sci-fi visions of Transylvania. You have a lot of the Gothic, and I want us to get to see more interesting versions of the Gothic that use Transylvanian models. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Are you okay to stop sharing, Cristina?
Yeah.
Thank you.